It's cold, but it's also just beautiful to watch and look from your bed because you're like, well, I'm just going to stay nestled in my covers. So again, thank you all so much for being here and having me this morning. I am drinking tea. So if you have your tea or your coffee, please do get some. If you need something else to get your morning started, a stretch or a smile, let's have that too. But however we need to ease into the morning, let's try to. But again, thank you. Densil Porteous, he, him, his. Glad to be here with you all and spend a little time talking. And for us, thank you so much. I do hope it is a conversation. I didn't come with a prepared script or sort of 3 points to get you going or a good word of wisdom to send you on your way. I think what I really like to do is just share a little bit of my story to the journey that I'm where I'm sitting in several seats as CEO or leader of an organization. And then open the space up hopefully for questions or, again, as I'm speaking, engagement if anyone has one. So either raise your hand or I think you can use the raise hand button on the screen. I'll see as people unmute. Maybe that also can be a signaler if someone has a question. But again, thank you all so much and look forward to the conversation. So Densil Porteous, he, him, his. Yes, I am currently serving as CEO of Pride Fund One, which is a venture capital focused on LGBTQ identities as well. And that started in June of last year, so June of 2020. I also became CEO of Stonewall Columbus, or interim director, executive director last June as well. The third job that I got last year, which no one really talks about very often, is I also became a dad. So after being a foster parent to a beautiful young girl for 2.5, 3 years, in November, we officially became her parents. And so she turns 4 in about 2.5, 3 weeks. So I appreciate those parents at home with kids as well. My door is locked, so she could not get in this morning. But she is normally very pleasant, so it's actually nice. I don't have to worry about someone running in all the time and wanting my attention. She might come in and give a hug and then run out. So those are the 3 jobs that I got last year, and I think it's often sort of exciting for me to think about how 2020 was a beautiful year when I really sit back and think about it. I think for so many reasons, outside of just the ability to be at home during a pandemic and spend more time with my family. That was actually a beautiful thing because oftentimes I am so busy. The opportunity to have conversations, real conversations, as we reflect on race and ethnicity in our community, that's been exciting as well, because I think they're okay conversations to have. I think sometimes people have been uncomfortable about that. And then I'm actually quite an introvert. So it's actually been really great for me to stay home and not have to go out into the world and meet people. I understand, however, professionally, that's something that you have to do, right? Like you have to, I think I heard a couple of people with business development in their title, but, and this is a networking group, but that's what you have to do. Sometimes you have to sort of put on your big girl dress or your big boy pants and get on out there and do what you got to do. And so it was actually positively nice that I could stay home and do this actually. Getting to meet a lot of people during 2020 has been, and into 21 has been a phenomenal experience. So I started my journey to being the leader of several organizations and also board of several nonprofits, which I'll get to because I think that's a part of the story as well. I've always been motivated to give back to the community. And I think that comes in the form of professional work, but also volunteer work. The opportunity to be able to figure out ways to give back and find reward economically in your pocket and also in your heart has always been a central motivator for me. And maybe, I don't know, maybe, I came and was born in Jamaica, West Indies, so I'm not from America. I became an American citizen in 2016, 2018. And so for me, there's also this added layer, and maybe that's for a lot of folks and their families, but this added layer of being able to give back to a country who's given so much, or what it means for a family to come to America and have sort of that vision of America and what you can do. And so I've always been driven to be able to say, this is a place that has given so much to me, so how do I give back to it? And when I started in my professional sphere, my first job was an admissions officer at Kenyon College. I went to Kenyon College. Hopefully some of you know that. It's right in our backyard, about an hour northeast of Columbus. And I spent 8 years there, 4 years as a student and 4 years as an admission officer. For me, and that was my first experience with Ohio, and falling in love with this community. But for me, it was this space and place where I understood that for a period of my life and my time, I could sort of learn and explore, do whatever I wanted to. But that also was inspiring enough to say that I found this environment that allowed me to develop, and I chose to stay there and give back by becoming an admissions officer, and opening up that opportunity for other young folks to say, okay, I want to help other young folks think about education and academic exploration and what that's like for them. And so for 4 years, I stayed there and had a wonderful experience. I worked as a director of multicultural admissions, which allowed me the opportunity to work with a broad spectrum of identities, of races, of cultures and communities, and encourage them to explore higher education and what that meant. To explore higher education in rural Ohio may have been a challenge at times, but I think people, once you visit, you fall in love with Columbus, or once you visit, you fall in love with Ohio. So that's what happened when they went to Kenyon. So that made it easy. Again, that opportunity to be able to give back to a community and an environment that had done so much for me in terms of my 4 years of learning was critical. As I thought about higher education, I thought, is this a space that I want to live into? I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I thought I was going to be a psychologist. I realized I didn't really like dealing with people in either side of those spaces. As a lawyer, you can't really be as honest as you always want to with your clients. And so that's sometimes hard. As a psychologist, you have to deal with other people's energy. And again, I'm an introvert, so that was sometimes hard. But I did find that space in volunteering during my college time. That's when I first sat on my first board as a nonprofit director, and that was with Advocates for Youth. Advocates for Youth is an adolescent reproductive sexual health rights organization based out in Washington, D.C. And here I was at 19 years old, starting to sit on the board of directors for an international organization based in DC. But once again, there was that common sort of message of this was an organization that gave back to me. Advocates for Youth was an organization that helped me understand my identity as I came out as a young queer gay person at that time. And so for them, I learned and leaned on them as a resource of information and access to education. And so why would I not want to give back once again to another organization that helped me sort of become the person that I was turning out to be? So that's when my parallel roles of professional work and volunteer work sort of took off as I was in college and moving forward. After I left Kenyon and deciding that I wanted to sort of stay in higher education or not was critical for me. Had I fallen in love with the education experience because that was my institution, that's where I worked, or was it just an exciting thing for a 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old to travel across the country for free on someone else's dime, where you get to see all these great spaces and visit all these cool places and meet great people. I decided to explore a little bit more, and I took a job at Stanford University in California. So left Ohio, a place that I'd known for 8 years, and moved on out to the Bay Area, alone and on my own, with not a lot of connection to the community. I fell in love with that area, and that's when I, had the opportunity to start to lean into the tech sector a bit more. Working in Silicon Valley, you're directly connected to it, but I also just had an interest. And so I had an opportunity to start communicating and working with a number of startups, as well as tech ventures while I was out there, and being able to advise. There's a lot of ed tech companies that are out there that are trying to understand how they can infiltrate higher education, and make some money, but also as they would say, shake up or deconstruct higher education and education sphere. And so one of the first companies I worked with at the time was called Zinch. Zinch was a platform similar to Facebook, but Zinch was Facebook for high school students. And Zinch is now Chegg, Chegg.com. I don't know if any of you use Chegg, or maybe you're aware of it. Online textbook, resources for scholarships and other things like that. Zinch over time became bought by Chegg, and it was a great and beautiful journey for me because I was able to sort of see what that experience was like, advise the company at both points. So when they were Zinch, when they were Chegg, And that was, again, a beautiful learning experience. But all the time, still being a higher education administrator, still working in admissions, still pounding that pavement and recruiting students to higher education and helping them understand the importance of that sphere, and then still living this other life of nonprofit engagement. And at this point in time, now I became and working heavily with the Human Rights Campaign, and volunteering with that organization, which is the largest LGBTQ rights organization in the country. I guess I should probably say internationally as well. So you can see, for me, there was always this opportunity of sort of being able to ensure that all of the things that I was passionate about or loved and had interest in, I could explore, and sort of use to develop myself professionally, and continue that process. I left the Bay Area after being there for 6 years and moved back to Columbus, Ohio, because it was a place that I've always loved and knew that I could help come back to create. And sort of see the vision for the future. What I didn't say was I grew up in New York City after moving from Jamaica. And so I had this experience of big city life. I had the experience of what that meant. And so I had this drive and passion and understanding of what Columbus could be as the city was growing. When I first was living here and I came for college in 1998, Columbus was, I think at the time, the 16th or 17th city in the country, still called a small podunk cow town. But by the time that I was coming back in 2012, Columbus was seen as and known as the 15th largest city in the country. The state to watch as we led elections, and so there was this economic moment for Columbus, but also this sort of political moment that Columbus was going through that was really exciting for me to come back. When I came back in 2012, I had the opportunity to continue in higher education administration and worked at Columbus College of Art and Design, and spent time there, where I ended up being the vice president of admissions and financial aid for a number of years. Before leaving there and working at before leaving there and going to Wexner Center for the Arts at Ohio State University and being the director of Director of Marketing and Communications. And that was a great experience. Again, still in higher education, but sort of in a different side of things. When I came back to Columbus in 2012, I also got really involved in the local volunteer and community engagement opportunities. And I joined the Create Columbus Commission. The Create Columbus Commission is a body of 40 or so young professionals who influence the region through social enterprise, but also through engagement with our community and elected officials. For 2.5 years, I worked as the chair of that organization. So I helped them, they used to be a commission of the city of Columbus, and then helped them become an official 501c3 organization. And so that was an exciting opportunity again to once again come back to Columbus and literally actually help create Columbus as the chair of the Create Columbus Commission. The organization now is in its 3rd year as a nonprofit entity under new leadership, which is exciting to see. But still seeing how we've impacted the city. So even during the last year in Columbus, as we've dealt with some of the issues of racial injustice and inequity in our community, as we've had to deal with some of the issues with our police force and our elected officials, the Create Columbus Commission has been central in helping guide that conversation and serving as a resource and a body for young professionals in the community to talk about issues that are related to our space. Under my leadership with the Create Columbus Commission, we also expanded our footprint a little bit to talk about from the Beltway to broad and high engagement. So realizing that Columbus is a community that is much more than just downtown Columbus. We have deep and close interconnection to folks all the way outside of right up to the Beltway and outside of that Beltway space. Right here is a perfect example as we engage with Westerville. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were, as an organization, thinking critically about the community that we were a part of, but also the community that we saw growing around us, and how we can intentionally impact that community. So in 2020, all of these sort of nexuses of identity start to come to head for me. In 2020, I left my professional experience and my professional job working at the Wexner Center for the Arts at that time. and started to lean into my own nonprofit organization consulting business that I've had around since 2015. I was ready to take some time off. It was the beginning of January. COVID hadn't really hit the world yet. I was paying attention to it out there, and I quit my job, which was sort of nerve-wracking, earth-shattering, fear-making. Here I was at under 40, a house that I just purchased, a dad in the works, right? I had a kid. If I messed up, I was like, I'm going to lose the child. My partner and I were thinking about what's next. And so I decided to quit my job at the beginning of 2020. Right. Smartest move ever. But it turned out to be the smartest move ever, quite frankly, right? Like it was this moment where I fully had said, I had taken all of the experiences I've had and was about to just lean in and live into myself. I was, and I did that. So I left my job at the beginning of at the beginning of January, into 2020, took some time, started connecting and networking with people, had lots of meetings in February and March. My calendar was booked. I said I was taking off time. I was just going to ease into whatever I was going to be doing next. And by the end of March, mid-March, I was as busy as ever. As the pandemic was sort of crippling the country and communities were afraid of what to do, all of the things that I had been sort of living into at that point in time kicked into action. All of my nonprofit experience really helped out as organizations that I was sitting on the board for or who were looking in the community for services were calling. How do we reach our donors? How do we reevaluate our governance structure? How do we survive this pandemic that is crippling our community? How do we fight these injustices of racial inequity that are starting to pop up? How do we do the work of being anti-racist? All of these things started to pop up in my spaces. And luckily I had quit my job in January, so I was able to jump in and help out. And so, my April, May, and the rest of 2020 took off in an exciting and wonderful way. But it was that ultimate opportunity from the very beginning, being able to sort of live into and give back to the things that had done good for me, that brought me to this space. And not everybody's journey to sort of their full and final space is sort of the same thing or motivated the same way. But for me, I've always lived into give back to the things that have done good to you. And hopefully that'll come back in tenfold or more than that, right? And I think that's what's happened for me, right? All of the spaces and places where I've received some beauty, I've learned something, I've been able to grow, move forward, and benefit from. Anytime I've leaned back into those spaces and opportunities, it's been a beautiful moment. And so for me, here I am right at, I just turned 40 this year. I became a dad. I'm the CEO of 2 organizations. And I believe I'm the happiest I've been in my life in quite some time. And that's exciting. And that's wonderful. But I think, like I said, everyone's journey is not that. And it takes time, through all of the positives that I've seen in the last year. I've lived, 30 plus years of struggle before that. So I think as we think about sort of who we are as humans, happiness doesn't come from the very beginning. We have to fight for it. And there are going to be lots of down days and sad days and struggle moments. But I think if we continue to fight for happiness, and think about the things that have given us something and figure out how we give back to those spaces and places, then we'll end up in the right place. So that is a lot. I sort of feel like, it's my story is sort of a lot of things. I didn't even give, sort of the deeper backstory, but I tried to keep to the work side of things and some connections in places. But I want to open it up for questions as well. I just thank you for letting me share some of that. I think it's been interesting in the last couple of months as I found that I'm telling my story more. And the more that I tell it, all these little moments of things keep popping up that I hadn't thought about before. So it's always exciting, an opportunity to do this and connect with folks. So thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That's an awesome story. You had touched on recently taking risks, right before 2020 for the pandemic had occurred. Tell me, what were some thoughts, like what were some concerns about taking those risks, and how did you help mitigate against those? And what are some good words of wisdom to to like just dive in and take some risks of your own, if you wouldn't mind.
It's so funny because I think, and thank you for that question. It's funny because I think as we get older, we hear our parents say, "Oh, when I was younger, I should have done this," or like I had. It's so true, right? Like it's the most. Like I mean, as I sit back as a parent now, and I'm like, you have nothing to worry about. Take all the risks that you can, right? Because the moment you start to get stuff and have to worry about things, then that's the biggest problem, right? Because right, that's you. I was a psychologist or a psychology student, right? Like we start to have this issue of like fear mitigation, and it's like, oh my gosh, wait, I have to think about these things now, right? Like, and so I'm a grown up, or I have more responsibility, or I have more stuff, so I can't take the same risk that I did yesterday or the day before that. And so I think there's a benefit to being young, right? But the notion of saying you don't have a lot of stuff to worry about, I think that's the very first thing I would say to anybody. Like, just do it when you're younger, because you don't have a lot of stuff to worry about. You don't have to start worrying about retirement just yet. I mean, you should be, but when you're younger, it's easier, right? Like I got a financial planner at like 35, and I'm like, what am I doing, right? But like again, if someone had told me, if at 35 or even 20, someone had told me at some point you need to think about a financial planner, I'm like, sure, I'll think about that like in the future. But no one told me about it. And at 35, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, is this too late? So anyway, when you're young, take all the risks, right? Because you just don't have a lot of stuff. And I think and I wish someone had really said that to me when I was younger. I mean, I think people sort of say that in a passing moment, but like if I were like 12 and someone shook me and said, do it now, don't wait, I think I might have listened, right? Like I think I might have listened. And I think that's what helped me, I think, finally sort of understand that there's no better time than the present, right? Like life is a bunch of cliches and phrases, right? Like you say all these things, but like literally there's no better time than the present. Because the longer you wait, the longer you're likely going to talk yourself out of it. The longer you wait, it's like X, Y, and Z. This is, and I say this with all of the passion and love in the world. I said to my parents the other day, I said, this is one of these moments where like if in COVID, as an older person, right, like my mom and my parents, they're retired, whatever, I said, you shouldn't have to even worry about taking the COVID vaccine. Take it, shut up, right? Because you're at sort of that arc of another space, right? When like you're on that, and this is horrible, but again, this is the one time in your life, I think, when as an older person, it's okay to take the gamble. Right, it's sort of like okay, and then I can understand as a younger person where I'm like I'm a little anxious because I still have so much more left to live. I'm still doing it though, but again, right, like as a young person, take all the risks now, right? Like the only other time that someone say may take all the risks is when you're older and we're sitting in this pandemic and it's like, hey, what, so I think so I think that's a beautiful thing for me. When I left my job last year, I got to the point of saying yes only because I was able to have taken time to think intentionally about what I had to do. And it was the worst time in my life, literally the worst time in my life. The time before quitting my job was the worst time in my life because I knew that it was coming. I knew this like moment was there, but I had to work so hard to make sure that everything was neatly like in a package so I could feel good to leave, right? Like I had to make sure I had enough in the savings account. I had to make sure that my mom and dad were on speed dial because I was like, look, I know I have a partner and a kid, but I may be coming back to live in the basement, right? Like, I mean, it's like, I had to make sure that all of these things, more so than any other time in my life, were prepared so that I could quit and sort of live freely. Right. So I think that was not exciting. But then once I was able to do it, it felt great. Like once I was able to say, yeah, I'm in the space, I've got everything, ready and prepared. But then the pandemic hit and I was like, oh, great. But I was ready. I had a map, I had a plan, and I will tell you that, again, no time is better than the present, because what happened if in January, at the beginning of January, I heard about the pandemic that was coming to America. And then I was like, forget it. I can't do it now. Right. Because then I would have been so afraid. I could not let that stop me because I was like, you got to keep powering through. So yeah, that sort of finally it was sort of, I had to get all of these things lined up and take before I could do it. And I jumped in head first.
Densil, I have a question for you on that front. That's really inspiring to hear before 9 o'clock in the morning. You've taken a leap of faith in so many ways, and you're at this point in your life. So I think personally, it's really inspiring to hear. I know you mentioned that you're a boomeranger. You went to the West Coast and came back, and you're really involved in the community. For us, being kind of in the private sector and in business, and those that we might see come back to Columbus post-COVID, what are your suggestions, or what was your approach to getting back involved in the community, and how did you really get right back to it?
Yeah. And so, Stephanie, thank you for that question. And before I forget, I wrote a little note because I was excited for Ohio Health, and so Kent and Stephanie and the Family Pride Network, I was excited to have you all on here. And maybe I'll figure out a way to connect back to the story, because I want to specifically say thanks for all that you've been doing in partnership with us. It's interesting because again, as I said earlier, I'm an introvert. I recharge by sitting by this is actually really exciting to me, because I'm locked in my room or in my office by myself, and knowing that even if there are people in the house, they can't come in. It's a great recharging moment. I would say that if we were all in the same room together, I would be a little extra exhausted, and in all the positive ways, right? Like, not because it's like, because when I'm in a space with people, I'm thinking about everyone. I'm thinking about how we interact together. I'm thinking about the language that I use, and so that's a lot for me. So being able to have to go out and network with people is exhausting. I mean, as much as it is, like, again, I love humanity, but people are exhausting, right? Like, that's like, because you have to think about all these things, right? And so and there's extra there. I don't like to use the term empath, but I feel like I've started to use that. I'm a Trekkie at heart, so I should probably lean into it anyway. So whatever, empath, right? And so I think that's a thing that, like, I realize and I understand. And so I have to be very intentional about putting myself out there in spaces so that I can connect with people, or so that people can connect with me, right? At some point in time, I realized that I also accept that I'm a connector of people, because I like to just be in these spaces. And so, of course, after a certain point in time, it's like, oh yeah, well, I've met so-and-so before, maybe I can connect you with so-and-so, or it's like, oh, well, I know that you've met so-and-so because you're in this group together. So I'm coming to connect with you because I appreciate that you might be a connection point, or I feel comfortable connecting with you because I know that you know someone else. So I think that's what it was for me, is like, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew that whatever I wanted to do in the world meant having to put myself out there to be in places where connections could happen, or be in places where someone could see me so they could feel comfortable making a connection, right? Because I think relationship building is not necessarily about you raising your hand. It's also about someone else raising their hand, but they have to feel comfortable to raise their hand to connect with you, right? So after this moment, like, everyone on this call should feel comfortable sort of raising their hand to say, hey, I want to go connect with Densil, right? Like, and even if we didn't speak to each other one-on-one, right? Like, the space has now been opened that it's a little bit more okay to connect, right? And I am a very forthright person, a very open person, so I can say, you know what, our connection will go deeper than just sort of that surface connection when we connect for the first time, right? Like, even if I really don't remember the conversation, or again, like I said, if we didn't talk, but if you reach out to me, the connection is already one step more advanced than just someone else. So I think that was it for me. Like, I just had to, again, knowing that I'm the introvert that I am, knowing that people are exhausting for me, I had to do the intentional work. And I continue to do that even today, right? Like, this was intentional for me, right? Like, I have intention. I love sharing and connecting with people, but again, the connection is a thing, right? Like, as I'm seeing some of these faces here, I'm like, I think I've seen some faces before. I can't remember where I've met some of these faces before. But after this moment, again, there's a new relationship that's there. It was a pleasure for me to come and have this conversation, because from my Stonewall hat, right, like, I want to see Stonewall doing more with Westerville. I mean, technically we do, because when I look at my website statistics, Westerville is the third most engaged area that comes to look at resources from Stonewall, right? I also know that we host Pride every year. 800,000 people come to Pride. We don't have 800,000 people sitting right in Columbus. So I know that, people are coming from Westerville, and Grove City and all these other spaces. So, that's intentional work for me, when I think this is important to have my story told to this community, but also for Westerville to say, hey, there is actually a relationship with Columbus through Stonewall, and what can we do to be better partners in that space? So, long answer, but I think, and being, just again, I think it is doing the work of being intentional to go into spaces and places and be present, right? Like you don't have to necessarily connect individually with people, but oftentimes if they see you just in those same spaces, it helps. And then if you know that they were in the same space, again, it helps, right? Like maybe there was someone else who was at the session that you wanted to, to connect with, but you didn't get a chance to talk to them either. You can just use that as that connection point and moment, so yeah, I think that's it. It's just doing the intentional work to be and put yourself in these spaces, and then just be open to the connection once it comes.
So I had a quick question. You mentioned, really spending time connecting with people post-pandemic, or pandemic start, I guess, right? We're not post-pandemic yet. Have you found, right, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, like what areas have you found that have been most receptive to connecting versus others that have been harder for you to get in with?
I think everyone's been open. Like, honestly, like I have met so many people. And so I'm actually, it's interesting because I think at the beginning of the pandemic, right, like we were living in a real world. And so I was connecting with people real time, and they were okay with that. Like in sector, out sector, nonprofit, whatever, like they were great about it. What the pandemic has done that I am so appreciative of is that it's allowed me to connect with more people and from further distance, right? Because I'm thinking through this time, I've had meetings with people in China and Australia and England, and so and normally I'm like, that's too early, I'm not getting up that early, or they're not going to do it, but people are willing to do more as well. So I haven't personally found it difficult to get into spaces and places or sectors that we haven't seen before. I think people have just been more apt to say yes. And I think that is also some of where the exhaustion is coming from people. So just, right, let's acknowledge that, like we are literally saying yes to more meetings. Like we have to acknowledge that, because it's like, well, it's easy. I don't have to like get in my car and commute 15 minutes to the other side of town, right? Like I can just pop on the screen and here we are. And so that's the great thing, right? A snowy morning, like if this was a real thing, who's going to leave their house this morning? It might've been like me and two people in a room, with a coffee cup, and that would have been sad, right? But it made a little bit easier. I think there's probably still some people who are like, I'm not leaving my bed because it's snow out. But so I think that was I think this again, 2020, I think was a privileged moment and opportunity for us, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how we come out of this moment and still stay connected this way, right? Like I know I'm going to still want to use video calls. I've always wanted to use this stuff. Well, not on my phone. I don't like that. Like on my phone, I hate it. But like I've always been one that's like, we have these cameras on our computers, let's use them. Like the moment computers had cameras, I was like, yes, let's do this, right? Because I understood at that point in time, that meant I could connect with more people, and the distance didn't actually matter anymore, right? And so that was a great thing. So, again, as I said, at the start of the pandemic, while I was able to connect with people and people were still open to it, the moment we had to stay home, people rethought how they built relationships and made connections. And all of a sudden, Zoom was skyrocketing in stocks, right? Like, and I knew it was going to happen, and I should have been paying attention, but I didn't buy it in time. I did buy some other stocks in time, so that was great. But I knew it was going to happen. Like, I literally sat here at home, looked at my partner, and said, "Watch X, Y, and Z," right? Because we knew we are hungry for connection, right? And not only were we going to create new connections, we were going to multiply those connections, right? Because that's exactly what happened. Right now, everyone has multiplied their connections. I'm sure that everyone on this call, hopefully, I would imagine, right? I'm going to speculate, has met probably 3 times more new people than they would have in a regular year, right? Like if you sit back and think about the number of meetings and faces that you've seen, right? Like, and it's probably been more than you might have thought of, like on a one-to-one moment in a regular year. That's amazing. That's great. So anyway, so I think that's the long answer, Justin, is, I think I haven't seen any sort of spaces closed off. I think people have been more apt to say yes to meetings. And I think my concern will be how we stay connected on the other side. That's important. Well, at least for me anyway, maybe not other people, but staying connected to the people that I've connected with, that's important on the other side.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? It's Amber. Hi, I'm the one with no camera. But I just wanted to say, Denzel, it's been so awesome listening to you. You have such amazing energy this morning. Are you on LinkedIn?
I am. If you find LinkedIn, please, everyone connect.
Yeah, I would really like to connect with you, but I also had some questions about volunteer work in Columbus. What do you do volunteer-wise in regards to diversity?
I don't. I mean, well, let me say that back. Let me like sort of rewind it. I believe I live a philosophy of representation matters, right? And so that philosophy to me means I'm just living my life and showing up in spaces and places where being is actually the work that needs to be done, right? So as I think about my journey, my career journey, my volunteer journey, I often am sitting in places and spaces where you don't see a lot of brown and black people, and so that's sort of my work of diversity, right? When I was the director of diversity and multicultural recruitment at Kenyon, I remember being so reticent about like wanting. I didn't want that job. I didn't want it. Like I was like, I want to be an admissions officer. That's all I want. And after 2 months of being in that role, they asked me to step into the diversity recruitment role, because they saw I had a talent in terms of connecting and helping people find connection. But for me, in that moment, it was less about, again, actually doing the diversity work and more about representation, right? So for me, I understood that at the time and still in higher education administration or higher education period, you didn't see a lot of brown and black folks attending schools like Kenyon College or, the Stanfords and the Harvards and all these other private selective schools. I mean, you didn't see a lot of brown and black folks at a lot of schools, but those were those particular places. And so for me, it was important just to be on the road as a visual representation for young folks to say, hey, there's an opportunity for me to be able to do this. So I think when I come to volunteer work, that's oftentimes how I think about my quote unquote ethnic diversity work, is to say I show up in these spaces. So my time working and volunteering and being on the board of directors for the Human Rights Campaign, although the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, which is an element of diversity, for a long time and still today, the LGBTQ movement hasn't been very comprehensive in terms of looking at the full community, right? So it's been oftentimes, a lot of cisgendered white folks versus thinking about that they're I think the thing that I'm getting excited, the LGBTQ identity, right? Like just like the heterosexual identity, it's an identity that like spans every spectrum of everything else, right? Like culture, religion, class, like you're everywhere, right? So like, so I think that, I think that's the thing that, to me is important when you're thinking about how just showing up as a black person in those spaces is different, because oftentimes you don't see it. And I mean, I think in the direct, and then in the direct way of doing diversity work in the community, I always share, I'm always willing to share my story. And that sometimes takes time for people, black and brown people, to feel comfortable sharing their story. I think, because oftentimes what you're trying there, it's sort of like, I want to share my story just because that's the struggle that I had to deal with. And I hope that someone learns from it. I believe in learn some, share some, right? So if I've learned something, I want to share that so other people can learn from it. And I think oftentimes as a black and brown person in predominantly white spaces, when you start sharing your story, you may feel like people are thinking, oh, well, you're complaining or you're attacking me. And for me, that's not the case, right? Like oftentimes I sit in these spaces because what I understand is people don't know what they don't know, right? Like, so it's important for me to show up and be in these spaces so people can see people in these spaces, so they can understand, right, that black and brown people are just like the majority population, or well, conversely, whatever that is now, right? Like, but right, and so I think that's sort of how I go about the work. Other people do diversity work differently in the community, but I sort of just live it. And then the work that I really focus on is a lot of the work in the queer community now anyway. So the silent identity, I think for me, when I think about the work, the places and spaces where we actually need to be standing up for people are the places where the silent voices can't speak up for themselves, right? So when we think about, young folks in the foster care system, right? I'm a foster parent because these are young folks who don't really have a voice, right? That wasn't their choice. And so why should they, be penalized for this. So when I think about, stepping up and sort of living into LGBTQ identity, again, another silent identity, where so often you don't have to say anything, but oftentimes you are afraid of saying anything. So therefore you choose to hide who you are. I don't think people should have to hide who they are, right? I think that's the beautiful beauty about who we are as humans and as humanity, is that the individual identities across each of us makes us a beautiful salad that we want to come together. And I like salad, so maybe that's the great thing. Other people might not like salad, right? But there's, again, beauty in that. And I use the salad analogy versus the melting pot analogy because I'm not a fan of the melting pot analogy, right? Like a salad still allows you to represent each, again, individual identity that comes together to make something beautiful and amazing and healthy for you, right? And so I think that's how I think about sort of about the sort of doing this work, right? Like I come to say that I'm showing up in these spaces as an individual representative of the Black and Brown community, and hopefully therefore then people who are not used to Black and Brown folks in these spaces, they see, they learn, they understand, they then strive to do the work to be better and do better. Long answer, Amber, sorry, but thank you. That's how I think about it. Okay.
Blessed to work for Ohio Health, who has really leaned into the diversity, inclusion, conversation, education, and really commitment. It's become a part of our culture. It's one of our core values. Education has been clear. I do a lot to get involved beyond the Diversity and Inclusion Council. In the education and ability I've received has been amazing. I guess my question would be, as a young professional that might not have those resources, what is the biggest thing that we can do to help with this movement, making this, instead of a movement, just life, and really helping out?
Yeah, it's interesting, and thank you for that question, Ken. And my Ohio, I love Ohio Health. Ohio Health has been so amazing, and I think really in this diversity space in particular, I used to do a lot of fundraising for the Human Rights Campaign and having them do our annual gala, and just working with education moments for the community, and even now at Stonewall, I've reached out to Ohio Health. I have this full belief, right? I'm all about knocking down walls, right? Like I don't want to go over a wall, I want to knock it down, like barriers are gone. And I have a deep understanding of the connection to health in our community, for every community, right? Not just only in the queer community, but I think when you think about underrepresented populations within the community, so oftentimes those aren't the communities we think about, right? Like women's health for so long has been under sort of focus because, again, majority men, the men were sitting in power, but now we're thinking critically about sort of women's identity and health and why that's important. And I think for me in the LGBT community, we're focusing on trans identity and trans health. And so Ohio Health has been a really great partner in some of those conversations. So anyway, I think it's interesting because I just went on this whole tirade about Ohio Health and their connection, and now I've lost the question a little bit. Can you phrase it for me again? I know where it is. It's like lost in my, I had a great response for it.
I think just as a young professional, how can we really add value and really help with this movement? And
the moment you started talking, it came back to me. It was like, oh, there it is. I think it's a thing that I talk to people all the time. It's like, I think we have to think about it as sort of a steady drumbeat, right? So with anything, right? And so you don't want to stop beating the drum, because the moment you do, then you forget it. You want it to become sort of this rhythm that is consistently there, a rhythm of life. Maybe that's probably the best way to think about it, right? So that it's not a singular moment. It becomes a movement, right? Like that this moment, but that's for anything, right? Like I think the more you talk about something, right, the more natural it becomes, right? And the more you understand it. So I think that's how our society has also shifted, right? Like the more that we talk about certain things, the more comfortable we become in those spaces. So I think it's the more that we talk about race and ethnicity, the more that we talk about identity and gender and sex and sexuality, the more that we feel comfortable realizing that these are normal aspects and elements of our community, for good or bad, for not or want, then it allows us to feel comfortable having these conversations. I think, again, as I alluded to that a little bit earlier in terms of, even being a Black and brown person in spaces, you didn't feel comfortable having conversations about identity because it wasn't a normalized thing. So I think as we start to normalize it and just put the information out there, right? And putting the information out there is literally just that, just putting things out there. People will tend to read. As an admissions officer, we called, lurkers. We had these, these kind of ghost applicants, right? Like you never talk to a student, and then all of a sudden you have like an application from them on the deadline day, and you're like, where'd they come from? But that's because we are lurkers, right? Like we are researchers, right? Like whatever you want to call it, like behind the scenes. Oftentimes, as people, if we're really interested in something, we are looking and finding it, and we look when it's just right in front of us, right? Like not often are we humans who want to go and seek, although we say seek to understand. We know there are a lot of people who don't want to seek to understand, but they want to understand. So I think, again, it's sort of that continual steady drumbeat, because that rhythm is there. So any kind of conversation or, information sharing, whether that's a Facebook post about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever's happening in the space, or reflections of, or normalizing a thing, the more that we're able to put that, in marketing terms, put that content out in front of people, right, the more comfortable people will be talking about it. Or again, there's really no reason why, as a society and community, that we shouldn't talk about race and identity and culture and the discrepancies between women and men's pay. Like we should talk about those things, and we should not feel bad about them, right? Because again, as we've come to understand, when we learn, we strive to do better, right? So it should just be simply a reflection on the past. And if you want to blame someone, then blame someone before us, right? But there should be no blame. Ultimately, and this is me being Pollyanna, right? Like it's literally the notion of us striving to be a better, more perfect union, right? Like, so again, the more that we continually talk about the things, the more that we put them out there in the open, the more that we normalize them, that it's okay to talk about them, because all we're trying to do is we're striving to be better and do better. And so I think that's what I say, right? Like the more that we're able to normalize the conversation, steady drumbeat, put information out there, have conversations, share information, then that conversation becomes easier, and stays consistently at the fore for people.
Denzel, I really appreciate your analogy of the salad and everybody coming together, because it does make, if you take it on a business side, it makes every business stronger when you have all of those different opinions coming together. And our chamber has just started BIOC, Business Inclusion and Opportunity Council. And it is people of diverse cultures. And it's really been very fun. We've only had 5 meetings, but they have goals set, and they're actually putting strategies together in our meeting next week. And it's, when you say black skin, brown skin, it's also LGBTQ, it's people that are Egyptian, it's all kinds of mix of people, but they're getting a voice. And we're in the area of advocacy, competitive business opportunities, so that we can develop kind of like a short list that you might see in Columbus when people go out to an RFP.
Yeah.
Are we putting diverse people in that list for our Westerville schools and our city, Westerville, and our Otterbein University and the library, when they're going out getting quotes? Are they looking at a diverse population to do that? And then another area is advocacy and diversity, and then just the chamber involvement, and maybe looking at, we haven't said it specifically, but looking at having a diverse population of people represented on community boards in our community. If you look at a lot of our community boards, they're pretty vanilla. And how do we mix that up? And our chamber board is the same way. So we need to recruit people of diverse cultures to want to work in our community, and also business owners. So I just wanted you to know that we're definitely on that page, and I wish I could bring you to every meeting. It would be very fun to have you there. And then there is a community initiative, if those of you that want to get involved as well, that's for definitely on the social justice. It's the Black Lives Matter, but they are looking at hiring a diversity officer for our city. This organization they're becoming a 501c3, and their goal is to raise $10,000 by April 1st to start the funding for this position. So lots going on in our community. So I really value everything that you've accomplished. So thanks for sharing.
Well, no, thank you. And I'm excited to hear, it's interesting because you go to business school, or, I went to business school, and you learn, or at least in the classes that I took, we talked about diversity in the business place, and how that's a benefit and boom to the sort of economic and uplift of the company. And it's interesting to think that shift has only been relatively recent, but we see the beauty in diversity of thought, right? Like literally, it's hard for people to sometimes embrace that. right? But there's such beauty in diversity of thought and how things can change, right? Like the moment you bring different ideas into a company that has been struggling to solve a solution, then what happens? You usually solve something, right? Because someone comes in with a slightly different perspective and that thinks about just a slightly different way, and then allows whatever it is to blossom and bloom, right? And I think that's what often happens in many of our communities. I think, you know, even here in Columbus, we've seen how our community has blossomed and bloomed as a diversity of people who have come here, and not necessarily just, you know, which you've highlighted so well, not necessarily just race, but also the ethnic diversity, the cultural diversity, right? That has come to our community has helped us bloom, has helped us become known less as a cow town, right? Like that is. So there, you know, so I think there's such beauty in it, but as I go back to, right, we should always remember that it is those individual identities that came together to make such a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I'm just glad to be here and have a conversation. And Janet, if you need me to show up at a meeting, you just call. And if I'm free, I'll try my best to be there.
Okay,
You can keep me in your pocket, right? Actually, now technically you can just put me in your pocket and say, I'm going to call Densil, and I'll pop on a video screen. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Did anybody else have any questions? I know we're coming up on 9. Want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I just wanted to mention one other quick note that we had on behalf of our Young Professionals Committee. If anyone would like to get more involved, always feel free to reach out to anyone at the Chamber. But we are working with Otterbein actually next Friday, February 19th. They are putting together a Cardinal Connections event. And so it would be for, like, I believe it's their junior and senior population, but almost like a speed networking type event for business area professionals, and then for those students that would be transitioning into the workforce. And so if you are interested in being involved in that, it's at 4 o'clock on Friday the 19th. So feel free to reach out to me. You can always email or call the chamber, info@westervillechamber.com, if you would like to get more involved with that and be a participant for them. All areas of majors and concentrations and everything are represented there. So our Young Professionals is happy to support that as well. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, or? Thank you all for being here with us this morning. For us, did we have any other notes? I don't think to go over.
I think you covered them all.
All right. Well, as always, we're here for you. Thank you again to Densil for joining us this morning. I think we all, I'm sure, you know, having that, like Stephanie said, having that inspiration before 9 o'clock, there's just nothing like it. So thank you all for inspiring us to take risks. And I wrote down a couple of words I need to go look up: resistant or recitant, I think. So for expanding our vocabularies this morning and just giving us some new perspective. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you guys again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good day, everybody.
Great day.
Bye.
Thank you.